Welcome to another edition of the Dan and Joe Sports Show. As always, I'm Dan.
And I'm Joe.
Well, Joe, I'm going to start talking about the show with two games that I personally went to last week. Last week was an amazing football week for me. Both of these games turned out to be quite disappointing, but the experiences and the atmospheres were amazing. The first one on Thursday night, I got to go to the South Alabama Troy game. Probably the biggest South Alabama home game ever. This was a chance for South Alabama to legitimately be ranked in the top 25, to put themselves at the head of their division in the Sun Belt, which, of course, is a really good league this year, and to beat their most fierce rival. The Troy South Alabama game is known as the Battle of the Belt. And let me tell you, Joe, this was a heavyweight fight because, man, there wasn't a lot of scoring in it. It was one of the most defensive games I've ever seen in my entire life. Troy, of course, ultimately came down with a victory 10-6. And, the bottom line was South Alabama couldn't run the football. I think at the end of the game, South ended up having 38 yards rushing. It's hard to win any game when you do that. They threw a couple interceptions. But the one thing that I took away from it, Kane Womack was the defensive coordinator at Indiana. We've seen what's happened with Indiana football ever since he left. Indiana football 2 years ago was the talk of the town. Everyone was like, Tom Allen, this guy should get a job at any kind of school he wants to. His stock had never been higher. Indiana played Ole Miss that year in the Gator Bowl, and Kane Womack left to become the head coach of South Alabama. I think you're seeing how important he was to Indiana when they left, because Indiana's gone back to being the train wreck that it usually is in college football.
Mm-hmm. That's right. That's right. That's very, telling there. And I didn't, like I told you earlier, didn't get to watch a whole lot of the game, but just turned it on the second half towards the end, and really was just blown away with any game in this day and age ending 10-6. It seemed like it was kind of a throwback defensive rivalry game.
Yeah, Joe. I mean, it was very interesting because South Alabama really had one possession at the end of the first half where they had a really good 2-minute offense. And they threw a deep pass, which everybody in the stadium was losing their minds about because it looked like a great completion down to the 1 yard line. And I think South would have scored a touchdown there. And on the field, they called it a catch initially. The guy goes to the ground with the ball. He kind of lifts up, the ball pops up, but he reestablishes control before he hits the ground. And in my mind, that's a catch. I've never heard anybody say that that's not a catch when you can do that. I mean, he basically caught the ball twice, and yet they come in after a lengthy review and they say it was incomplete. And of course, everybody was losing their minds. They were so upset about it. And I, of course, wasn't watching on TV, but I don't understand how you could possibly justify that wasn't a catch. And that really kind of took the air out of the South crowd. South Alabama did end up kicking a field goal there to make it 7-3. But that was one of their only opportunities they had. And, talking about how old school it was, Joe, not only was there very little scoring after that, there was one more field goal by each team. I believe the last 10 minutes of the game was pretty much Troy just picking up first downs, running the ball like 3 plays in a row. And really just kind of a demoralizing way to lose, because it kind of reminded me in the fourth quarter a little bit of that USC Auburn game from back in 2002 when Carson Palmer and USC basically just bleeded the clock in the fourth quarter the entire time. Didn't score any points, but kept getting first downs. And that's pretty much what Troy did.
Mm-hmm. No, I could really see that. And it sounds like that overturned catch really made the difference, not having that, 4-point difference at the end.
Yeah, it would have gone to overtime, Joe. I mean, that was a very significant call. And there was a lot of other calls too that I was very suspicious of. And then to end the game, not that it really mattered, but South Alabama got the ball back with 10 seconds. They ran one play, and it was a clear incomplete pass. The guy caught it for a second, but he got drilled and dropped it. And they called it a catch on the field and let the clock run to 0.
Yeah, I saw that.
And then when they looked at it, I mean, even I could see from the stands there was no way that was a catch. And everybody went to the sidelines and they called people back on. You could tell they were just kind of we don't want to overturn ourselves here because we've already kind of dug ourselves in a hole. So you can go home now.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised about that sequence. Yeah.
I mean, so there was some very poor refereeing in that game. I think the Sun Belt sent their high school crew out for that one.
Mhm.
Um, but I look at it, and while there were some poor calls for South Alabama, it's hard for me to say you should win any game where you have 38 yards rushing.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, the only thing I would say is that, and I may have told you this before, I generally don't like it when they play Thursday night games of a big magnitude like a rivalry. Like, I personally don't like the Egg Bowl on Thanksgiving Day. And the reason for that is I think that football is a sport that's played best when you have a week off between games. You have time to study film, rest, and recover. And I just never liked a rivalry like that played when you really just had a truncated practice week.
Yeah, Joe, I think that's a problem, and I really thought that was going to affect the amount of Troy fans that came. But I gotta say, like, big shout out to the Trojan Nation. I cannot believe how many Troy fans came to that game. I mean, they were there, they were loud. I thought in a lot of ways they were louder than the South Alabama fans were, and they really showed a lot of pride in coming to that game and really great turnout. So, definitely in the future, if you're a Sun Belt team and you have Troy coming to the house, expect that they're going to bring some fans to it.
Yeah, I mean, and I get, it seemed like it was a great atmosphere, and having it on Thursday allowed it, to be a nationally televised game. But I just think that the quality, the product on the field would be better if it's played on like a Saturday.
I don't think there's any doubt about that. The last thing I'll say about one thing I liked about Troy was that I didn't realize their band all wore the Trojan helmets. I thought that was kind of cool. I like that.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, Joe. Now let's go to game 2 of Dan's misery weekend in football. Exciting to get to go to the games. Sad what occurred at the game. So, of course, we all know that it's always a tough road to hoe when Ole Miss goes down to Baton Rouge. Not a really good history there. They had lost every game since 2008. And of course, this was the most excited we had been about the Rebs' chance of winning a game in Baton Rouge since that time, really. And it started off just incredible. I mean, getting out to a 17-3 lead in the first quarter. Jaxson Dart's got receivers running wide open all over the place. They're establishing the run. And then, I mean, LSU kind of did what they've done all season. They've been a really good, sturdy team to come back. They did it against Auburn. They did it against Florida State in a game they lost. The only team they couldn't come back on, Mississippi State. I think Mississippi State was beating them by double digits. So they've done it like 4 times this year. The only team they couldn't do it on was Tennessee, who just really dropped the gauntlet so much early on. They couldn't do it. I mean, LSU responded like gangbusters. And what really surprised me, Joe, was the lack of a running game for Ole Miss. I knew that LSU was going to be a tougher team to run on, and that was one of the things I said scared me about this game. But I mean, in the second half, we could barely get a 2-yard run. I mean, they really shut it down.
Yeah, what happened with that, I believe, was that Judkins had to play, I think, 71 snaps on Saturday because Zach Evans was supposedly available. He suited up, but he was dealing with a nagging injury. And so I think for precautionary purposes, they didn't put him in the game. And so while Judkins is obviously, more than effective, not having Evans in the game, you kind of miss out on that thunder and lightning 1-2 punch. And I think that it hurt Judkins and he wasn't as effective in the second half. And I think additionally, obviously, you've got to give credit to LSU for being able to make adjustments after that 17-3 deficit. But what just is so staggering to me is the run that they went on to make this a rout. Like, it went from a promising Ole Miss dominating performance that everybody's going to be talking about to LSU just going on like a 42-3 run to close the game, I believe. After Ole Miss made it 20-17, it was 28 unanswered points for LSU in the second half. I mean, that was just so disappointing for me. And Ole Miss just did not have an answer at all for Jaden Daniels.
Yeah, I mean, in the second half, Ole Miss scored 0 points because LSU came back and tied it up 17-all. And I thought one of the most important parts in the game, at least in my narrative of Ole Miss winning this game, was when Ole Miss was able to get that drive and get that field goal right at the end of the first half. Because in my mind, I was like, you knew LSU would come back and throw some punches at you, but you took it here. You got a field goal. I think this is good for this game moving forward. And then in the second half, like LSU just laid down the hammer, scored 4 touchdowns in a row. I mean, you're right. Jaden Daniels was absolutely incredible in that second half. And I mean, he ran and made some space, and then he had wide open guys, and then he also did it with his legs. And I mean, really great performance, over 300 yards rushing and over 100 yards. Over 100 yards rushing and over 300 yards passing. In the modern day, that's what you're looking for with the quarterback.
Right, right. And it really wasn't a sequence where Ole Miss's defense really stopped LSU. Like you had a couple of red zone, I think 1 or 2 red zone missed opportunities in the first half. But like outside of that, LSU, I maybe remember them punting one time. I don't even know that for sure. Like it was pretty much domination. And part of the problem for Ole Miss is they've been dealing with some nagging injuries on defense. They really need a bye week at this point in the season. Obviously, they got to play A&M, so it hasn't come yet. But they're banged up with Troy Brown and had another player too. I'm trying to remember who it was.
And AJ Finley got hurt in that game too, didn't he?
Yes, AJ Finley and Troy Brown, who are arguably their best 2 defensive players. They didn't get to play much in the second half, and so while I think LSU was going to win anyway, the way it was going, like that just shows you how Ole Miss really just didn't have an answer for them.
No, they really didn't. I mean, there's definitely injuries affecting them. I mean, the Zach Evans ones is huge because you could see that Judkins was getting tired, and it's important to have that second back to really take some pressure off of them. I thought maybe they should use Bentley a little bit more because you could definitely see that Judkins was getting tired. And yeah, losing out on Finley, who's such an important safety player, which really in a game like that, when you have a mobile quarterback that's running through you and trying to find receivers after they're breaking away from the initial guy, safety is probably the most important defensive player you have.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I mean, Ole Miss has got to look in the mirror and make a lot of adjustments, which we'll talk about, previewing the A&M game. But just disappointing with how the second half went and how LSU turned it into a rout. But definitely credit LSU for how well they played. I also thought, I look at their defense like Wingo and Perkins Jr. They were really effective, and they pressured Dart. Like they hit him a lot. And, that was something he's not really faced. And he had his moments where he threw the ball really well, but LSU's defense, was just really formidable.
And Joe, there was one play in that game that I think really just kind of cemented where the game was going to go and the outcome. And it was when I knew that Jaxson Dart wasn't ready for the big leagues yet. Now, maybe he can change that at the end of this year, but the interception that he threw in the red zone when LSU got that lead at 24-20, not having the awareness to realize there's a quarter and a half left in this game. You're in field goal range right now. There's nothing wrong with getting the field goal right here and being down by 1 point. Instead, he's got a guy in his face. He had no clue where he was throwing that ball. You could see it. He completely threw up for grabs, interception in the end zone, and that was the start of LSU completely taking over this football game.
Right, right. And he had a couple of other plays where it should have been intercepted if the defense, had been in the right position or, kind of turned around to be able to make the play. And so he's been kind of playing with fire all year. That's always been a concern. And it unfortunately, came to fruition in this game. I mean, like I said, there were some moments where he and Malik Heath were just like on fire with the connection. But outside of that, there just wasn't a whole lot of, offense as far as the second half.
No, and I mean, we were talking about the line play. I couldn't believe how little pressure Ole Miss could get on LSU. LSU is not a particular great offensive line this year, and you look at what some other teams, including Auburn, did, and like getting home to getting home to Jaden Daniels a whole lot during the game, and Ole Miss had virtually a non-existent pass rush in that game. Jaden Daniels had all day to throw the ball. And conversely, Dart was just getting harassed. I mean, I think Ole Miss lost their best offensive lineman earlier in the game. And it was, he had no time to throw the ball. And definitely a game that I thought going in probably favored Ole Miss, at least on the offensive line. I would probably give a little bit of an edge to LSU's D line, but not the gulf that we saw in that game.
Right, right. And I think you make a good point about the lack of an effective pass rush because it's kind of peculiar. You had Ole Miss recruit some players like Taiwan Malone the last couple of years that we thought were going to be impactful at that position, but we haven't seen it at all. And Ole Miss tends to struggle this year with these mobile quarterbacks like a Jaden Daniels. They they can sometimes get into the backfield, but it's so easy for him to lay them and get away. And then by that time, there's like an extra man open because they did the blitz. And so Ole Miss just has to make some big adjustments when it comes to defending mobile quarterbacks. Otherwise, they're just going to be, eaten alive when it comes to quarterbacks like KJ Jefferson.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could see a little bit when Ole Miss played Auburn and the kind of success that Robbie Ashford had against them in the second half. I mean, I knew that was a sign that if Robbie Ashford could do that, then Jaden Daniels could probably do even worse to him. So yes, there's definitely a lot of things that need to be improved, especially on the defensive side of the ball. But, the biggest takeaway that, like I said, I took from that game was that Jaxson Dart does not appear able to win a game on his own yet. And that's what they needed in that game.
Yeah, he's got, a lot of improvements made with experience. And, Ole Miss, they've got to have, a full running back core. But even then, I think the disappointing thing for me was that I can't even convince myself that even, fully healthy, they, are in a one possession game. Like, I feel like there was clearly that separation there.
No, LSU appeared to be a much better football team. And, in my mind, I would have liked to have seen Altmaier get some snaps, but I don't know that really would have made any difference.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Joe, speaking of not making any difference, let's go to the other side of Mississippi and look at Mississippi State and their just incredible awfulness when they play Alabama. I mean, I don't even want to watch those games anymore, and I didn't. I just got done being at the LSU Ole Miss game, was on my way back. We were in a nice restaurant outside of Baton Rouge eating, and the game was on in the background. It was just as ugly and awful on Mississippi State's offense as I imagine. And Joe, this game was so bad that Mississippi State scored a touchdown on the last play of the game, and apparently it's the first touchdown they've scored in Bryant-Denny since 2014. What a pathetic stat.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the stats on this game. I saw that Will Rogers threw the ball 60 times, which is always a recipe for disaster when your quarterback throws it north of 40 to 50. I mean, 60. And then you look at Alabama, it's almost like they pretty much coasted to a win. Like, they didn't even really run the ball that effectively. I think they had no more than I don't even think they eclipsed 50 rushing yards, and they win this game like just going away. And so, yeah, to me, it just speaks more about how Mississippi State just did not present any semblance of a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, Alabama's clearly in their heads because Mississippi State has a lot of games. They play other teams, even years where these other teams are, somewhat as good as Alabama or in the same hemisphere, and they'll beat them or they'll be tight. But when they see that crimson on the other side of the field, they faint. They do. I mean, there's no doubt about it. You're looking at, I think, the last 3 years, Mississippi State scored a grand total of like 14 points against Alabama. I mean, that's horrible. And it gets so bad that Mike Leach apparently in the game said that he thought that anyone that wanted to scare people in Starkville should just dress up like Alabama players because Mississippi State's just terrified of them.
Yeah, and it's weird. I mean, this is, a rivalry that, is supposed to be somewhat unique because they're the two closest SEC cities to each other with Starkville and Tuscaloosa. And I can remember years like in high school, I think there was 06 and 07, State won back-to-back years against Alabama. In the 90s, State won an SEC West crown. I mean, in the past, it hasn't been a psychological problem. And I get that Nick Saban's there. But to me, it's not the losses. It's just the lack of being competitive.
Yeah, Joe, I mean, I can only remember one game where Mississippi State even had a real chance to beat Alabama, and that was when Dan Mullen was there. I want to say it was 2017.
Yes.
And, it was so obvious that if you just held back a little bit and guarded Jalen Hurts and running the ball, you would have stopped them. But they had Todd Grantham, and all he did was blitz every play, and they just, Jalen Hurts just ran it right up the middle and got a first down, and what I thought was a really bad coaching job by him and Dan Mullen.
Yeah, I think State led like most of the game and just kind of it evaporated at the very end.
Mm-hmm. And I think Alabama had like all their like best linebackers out in that game too. It was like a game that Mississippi State clearly should have won.
Mm-hmm. Right, their golden opportunity.
Right. Well, that opportunity's passed, and they haven't even had a chance to see the golden egg since then. Joe, let's get away from all this negativity and talk about a team that is excelling and taking full advantage of their opportunity. That's the Hypnotoads. TCU right now just playing great football. And yet again, they got another win over a top 25 team, and one in which they were losing yet again by double digits in the first half. Really interesting game because Adrian Martinez gets hurt, but yet the backup quarterback gets touchdowns on his first like 4 drives being the quarterback. And then TCU in the fourth quarter stiffens. They showed the Hypnotoad video, which for those of you who are not familiar with it, apparently TCU now has adopted the Hypnotoad as their unofficial mascot. The Hypnotoad came from Futurama and was a character that when you looked into his eyes, you got hypnotized, and he would use it to take over, different worlds and whatnot. And they've got great videos they'll show at TCU now where they'll superimpose the Hypnotoad in with all kinds of other clips. And then at the end, it's all hail the Hypnotoad, and he puts on a TCU jersey, and it's awesome.
Nice. No, that's really cool. And I mean, they've been playing awesome. I mean, their quarterback play to me has just really impressed me. I think their quarterback's only thrown 1 interception the entire year to 19 touchdowns on the season. He's been really efficient, flirting with 68% or so.
Actually, better than Hendon Hooker right now, stats wise.
Really? Wow.
Hendon Hooker is 18-1. Not much better, but it's 19-1 for Max Duggan.
No, that's unbelievable. And just like, to me, the other thing that impresses me is how TCU continues to pass every test. They keep ending up in these, difficult matchups, either with a team, that's like Kansas hosting them in a raucous atmosphere, or they're playing teams that are ranked, and then they just continue to win.
Yeah, I mean, like, talk about the stretch they've had. I mean, they had to go Oklahoma, Kansas, Oklahoma State, Kansas State. All those teams were ranked at the time they played them. So that's been a really tough 4-week stretch, and they made it through all of them. And we'll talk about it in the next show. But I think they got a really tough trip this week. I mean, because West Virginia has been a team that at home plays excellent football, but when they get on the road, they're just a bad football team. But this is a long travel to Morgantown, West Virginia, coming off the highs of the last 4 weeks. This could be a scary one for TCU, and we'll see how strong they are, because all these big wins they've had, they've all been at home.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. I think it's definitely a cause for concern.
That's right, Joe. There's a big cause for concern right now in College Station. It's where my wife is going to the game this weekend, where all the Ole Miss people are heading out to College Station. Their things are at DEFCON 3 right there right now. They just lost to South Carolina, Joe. I mean, I can't believe that. On the flip side, South Carolina, a great story right now. 5-2, they're ranked in the top 25. But talk about an embarrassing loss for A&M, who now we're looking at, they were preseason number 6. They've dropped 4 games already, and this has got to be the most embarrassing out of all of them.
I mean, it's tough for that fan base, because they expected so much this year. And, a lot of people are probably blaming, poor quarterback play. But you look at South Carolina on the flip side, it's not like Rattler has been lighting it up and they're winning games. And so to me, it just seems like their offense schematically is just not working. And everything I've heard is that A&M is definitely going to make a change at offensive coordinator at the end of the season.
Well, Joe, I mean, we know they're not making a change at head coach because they got to pay, $95 million, like straight out right there to get rid of Jimbo.
Right.
But yeah, what I'm interested to see though, Joe, is are they going to make Jimbo give up his play calling? Because he calls all the plays. Yeah. Because that's what I would do. I would say, listen, we know we can't pay you all this money. We've had 3 years in a row where your offense has been bad. 3. And you've kept calling plays. He hasn't even been putting on like the dog and pony show like Gus Malzahn did, where he'd be like, oh, I'm going to call plays this year. But no, this year I'm going back to being a CEO. I'm not calling plays anymore. I mean, Gus did that like 4 or 5 times. And I kind of think that was part of what led to his, ending at Auburn, as people were just so sick of him like flip-flopping on that. But, I mean, Jimbo hasn't even tried to do that. He's just always kept calling plays even when it's not working.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think you'll definitely see that change this offseason.
Yeah, I think that's the one for sure. But I think, Joe, the most disheartening thing, if you're an Aggie fan, is the fact that game wasn't competitive. The only reason it ended up being 30-24 is because the A&M put up like a couple trash touchdowns at the end of the game. It didn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What was it? An indicator of how close it was?
No, yeah. So, I mean, Definitely, it'd be a game of two very disappointed fan bases when we see the end of when we see Ole Miss and A&M. Joe, the last game I want to talk about before we move on to the next show is Clemson and Syracuse. This was supposed to be the game of the weekend, and it lived up to the billing there. Um, Clemson ended up getting another close win over Syracuse in what's been a hotly debated rivalry. And give us your thoughts on that game.
Yeah, just eerily similar to the 2018 game between these two teams when Chase Bryce had to come in the game for Trevor Lawrence. And you saw Clemson survive Syracuse 27-21. Syracuse was in complete control of this game to the first half, and they give it away. And you see Clemson once again make a quarterback change. But the story of the day, aside from the collapse, was Will Shipley was just unbelievable with like 170 rushing yards.
Yeah, Shipley definitely covered up some weaknesses. But, Joe, let me ask you this. Dabo's doubling down on the fact that that was a decision to bring DJ out just for that one game, and that DJ is still his guy. Do you think that Cade Klubnik's going to be the starting quarterback for Clemson in their next game?
I don't know. When I looked back at the stats, he only had 16 passing yards, I think, in the game. I think he had 2 completions, so you don't have much there. And so I didn't see enough probably there to convince me for sure that he will be. So I actually could see them going back to DJ at least one more time.
I think so too. To my mind, it's hard to make a change when you have 3 completions for 16 yards. It's not like he threw for 180 yards in the second half or anything.
Right. If he had done something like that, I could see it.
Well, Joe, speaking about a change, we'll end the show talking about this. How about the complete metamorphosis of Bo Nix as a quarterback? He was the most inconsistent quarterback ever, made me rip my hair out as an Auburn fan. This year, after the Georgia game, I mean, he's incredible. He's had multiple games where he threw for 5 touchdown passes, including last week in Oregon's mammoth upset of UCLA, where, right now, Oregon looks like if you had the 12-team playoff, they'd be a team that I'd maybe bet on to win a game in the playoffs if we had it.
Yeah, they're just playing unbelievable. It's almost like with their confidence playing a defense like Georgia the first game, it's like everybody now in the Pac-12 looks so much easier. It's almost like that did them a favor in some ways.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what's going to be fascinating is to see how much people are going to hold that against them. If they can somehow run the table, do they have a chance to make the college football playoff?
Mm-hmm. Right. That's going to be interesting.
It is going to be interesting. We'll talk about that more as we get closer to the end. You can catch all of our episodes on Spotify. Of course, you can also follow us on Twitter at DJ Sports Show and subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Dan J Sports Show YouTube channel. And as always, I'm Dan.
I'm Joe.